G'day everybody, welcome to your lecture on location-based mobile games. So in the previous lecture we looked at casual games, trying to understand what it was that makes a game casual and why it is that these elements have made casual games so successful. In this lecture we're going to be looking at location-based mobile games. So these are games that use things like GPS, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi to locate themselves in the physical world. Think Pokemon Go. But don't worry, if you haven't played Pokemon Go, we're not going to be comparing how many Pokemon we've caught. To start with though, I'm going to be going back quite far, to the flaneurs of the 19th and early 20th century. There we go, okay. So the flaneurs of the 19th and early 20th century were the idle bourgeois, rich Parisians who wandered the streets in an aimless manner. They didn't have jobs, they just had heaps of money and they kind of just needed to fill the time. The flaneur had a tendency towards detached but aesthetically attuned observation, which was brought into the literature of photography, particularly street photography. The flaneur is a roving and impassioned daguerreotype that preserves the least traces and on which are reproduced with their changing reflections, the course of things, the movement of the city, the multiple physiognomy of the public spirit, the confessions, the antipathies and the admirations of the crowd. So the idea here was there were these people who were kind of just wandering the streets of Paris, observing it, right? Observing the people around them moving from using the streets to move from A to B, and thus engaging with the city, its buildings, its streets, and its people in a very different way. Drawing on this, psychography was a movement that explored urban environments with an emphasis on playfulness and drifting, referring to it as a derive, an unplanned an unplanned journey through a landscape, usually urban, in which participants drop their everyday relations and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters that they find there. The study of the specific effects of the geographic environment consciously organized or not on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So this was, the derive was something that was developed and made possible by the Situationist International, a kind of Marxist intellectual organization that was active through the 1960s. Guy Debord was kind of one of the main scholars around this idea of being able to kind of disengage with your everyday relations with the city and engage with it in a different way. And in doing so, acknowledging the ways that the built environment shapes our movement through it. And I'm not just talking here about we walk on road paths because we don't want to walk in the middle of the road and get hit by a car, but how we might come to a place and feel as if we've known it, walk into a space and feel unwelcome, and what is it that makes us feel unsafe. Guy Debord, as a slight side note, was a notorious drunk. So some critiques of this have kind of said this was kind of a rationalization of his drunken and aimless wanderings through the city. But the chances are that you're already a psychogeographer. Debord is talking about the way that humans shape their environment, but also how the environment is shaping us. The way you can pick up these vibes, right? Feel it's good or bad. And this could be to do with the structure of a building, from the history of the area that you've intuited, all sort of things. It's about thinking about how we react to and reject the enforced ways of being in a space. The Situationist International were reactionaries and revolutionaries. This is about rejecting kind of the industrialization of the body through the way that the city has built this lived environment. And so, for example, a kind of interpretation of this can be seen in Frank Dresme's work, artistic work. Frank created this range of images that are a map. That isn't this kind of top-down, hyper-rationalized map that we might become used to, but is a map that reflects a different way of navigating, in this case, the city of Amsterdam, a collage-like image brought on by the aspects of his experience through the journey that he took, taking into account the environment that caused this experience. For a digital gains interpretation, who did this? Colio Bit is a kind of video exhibition, a reenactment of Vito Acondi's following piece, which was originally performed in, which inspired by the Situationist International and these ideas of psychogeography, was performed in New York City between October 3rd and 25th, 1969, part of a series of performance and conceptual events sponsored by the Architectural League, in which Vito Acondi would follow a person for a few minutes. If that person entered into a private space or a car, he would wait. But if the person, he would follow that person for a few minutes. And if that person entered into a private space or car, he would follow them if he could, or he would wait outside. And he carried out this performance every day for a month. And he typed up an account of each pursuit, and then sending a report to a different member of the art community of each of these reports, each of these pursuits. Col.io's following bit is presented today to a broader audience via different media. The month-long performance where the GDA 5 character would follow a non-player character in the game. These non-player characters aren't developed to have real lives, but it provided a very different way of engaging with the streets of Liberty City in Grand Theft Auto. This is a excerpt from the kind of media that was created around Col.io bit, but speaks to this way in which if we move through a physical environment under new rules, we can encounter it in a very different way. No longer is this the violent, crime-ridden city of Liberty City, but rather a regular and boring city. Another digitization of these questions can be found in the smartphone app, the Derive, which was released in 2011. Users of the Derive follow a series of simple geography-based directions, such as follow a red vehicle to create a Derive. Keep going until you see someone wearing a hat, and then turn left. These kinds of instructions. So Adriana de Souza de Silva and Larissa Hjorth briefly discuss in their reading a history of location-based urban play. They draw on three major historical comparisons: the Situationist International practice of the Derive, this cultural figure of the flaneur, the urban wanderer, but they also speak about the French subculture and sport of parkour, where one moves through a built environment as fast and with as little effort as possible, as a new type of playful engagement with an existing landscape. And the key thing to think about here is in these emerging discourses is the situated nature of activities and their influence on design, and not to mention the influence cultural understandings of play have had on these different mobilities. All of these that we might know exist within a discourse of subversion. Derive was a rejection of the kind of industrialized city. The flaneur is a rejection of the same kind of ideas of movement and kind of how we might experience the city. And parkour is a subversive kind of playful act, right? It's in the same realm as kind of graffiti and skateboarding, right? It's a different way of engaging with the city. It's taking the play out of the playgrounds, something kind of unfortunately is inherently wrong. So there are some critiques of these kind of narratives around urban play, in particular the Situationist International and the Derive. Game designer Mary Flanagan criticizes the use of historical metaphors in this context of location-based games, as de Souza and Hjorth do. Even though all theorists are bound by their own time, place, class, language, and ethnicity, and could be validly criticized for not attempting to more deeply question the drift as the drift, guided boards drift and Derive, as an activity with class, gender, and ethnic implications. These limitations detract from the Situationist International's attempt towards radical social and political change. What Flanagan points out is that in major cities throughout the world, the homeless, prostitutes, and domestic workers possess the streets in a way which speaks to their economic and social disempowerment. Their drift is a search for labour or an impossibly lengthy commute. De Board's drift is one of privilege, essentially. Nevertheless, the playable city movement is a kind of continuation of these ideas in the flaneur and in the Derive, a creative response like parkour to the coldness and anonymity of the urban environment, which technology threatens to make even worse. So the Playable City movement is an arts-based award which emerged as a counterpoint to the over-planning of smart cities, aiming to facilitate more open and friendly uses of urban space. treating play as this utopian ideal, unlike previous urban engagements which aimed to subvert and challenge urban structures and capitalism through disruption. Now, the utopian ideas of play present in the Playable City are familiar to that of the New Games movement, formed by Stuart Brand and others in the early 1970s in the United States as a response to the Vietnam War. The New Games movement tried to design experiences within public space to create more social and civic possibilities and engagements. I'm not going to speak too much about the Playable Cities, but my favourite is the 2013 Playable City Award winner Hello Lamppost. Inspired by the idea of the city as a library, Hello Lamppost encourages participants to look at everyday objects in the city differently, inviting people to strike up conversations with familiar street furniture using text messages or Facebook Messenger, bringing to light the hidden stories of their cities. They use the thousands of pre-existing identifier codes that label all kind of items of street furniture across a whole city, which was a way of categorizing and organizing them for maintenance. People could scan these unique codes and have unique conversations with particular objects, including lampposts, postbox, bollards, manholes, bins, and even telegraph poles. So to kind of move on and bring us back into the required reading for this week, D'Souza and Hjorth categorize location-based games into three different sorts: urban games, which use the urban environment as the canvas for the playful activity; location-based mobile games, which are played with cell phones equipped with location awareness, allowing the linking of information to places and players via this location awareness; and hybrid reality games, played with cell phones with internet connections and location awareness, which like urban games, transform the city into a game canvas, and like location-based games, utilize the relative position of the mobile phone to physical space. What distinguishes hybrid reality games is that they have an online component represented as a 3D virtual world taking place simultaneously in a physical and a digital space, right? So as you're doing this reading, I want you to be able to come to the tutorial understanding this distinction and which of the examples in the reading refer to each one. So D'Souza and Hjorth really have traced this really long history of location-based gaming, which is one of the reasons why I like it as a required reading, is because it really helps us understand the long history of mobile gaming, not just as something that has emerged kind of since 2008 with the introduction of the iPhone smartphone, but how there were many older games that utilized checking in or the broadcasting of our location to create playable experiences in the city. Geocaching is perhaps one of the oldest of those. Pervasive game as being one of the really dominant discourses, reminding us that the continual play of a game was really something new, and how these games often explore the blurring of the boundaries between play and non-play, and how significant the introduction of augmented reality has been in the past short amount of time. So having kind of talked through this history and the required reading that we've got for this week, I'm going to now talk a little bit about some useful concepts for thinking about mobile gaming. Firstly, I want to talk about space and place as two different things. Place and space impact how we understand our media and are especially relevant to understanding mobile media. Sir Humphrey uses the term meat space as a way to focus on the proximity and materiality of space and bodies in the real world. Distinguishing between space and place reflects the spatial turn within sociology, back to the work of scholars like Henry Lefebvre in the 1970s, who identified how space was something that was produced socially. It's produced by, and in turn also reproduces and reinforces, particular modes of social relation. Doreen Massey in the 1990s added place to this discussion through feminist geography, recognizing how places have multiple identities and are in constant processes as well as being under production. There's also the mobility turn in social sciences that occurred during the 1990s, an extension of the spatial turn in the 1980s, which shifted how we think about the increasing levels of movement in the city and how this impacts the makeup of contemporary society, going from being kind of villagers in our little kind of village that we never left our entire lives to fully global citizens connected at scale. The mobility turn really emphasizes when trying to understand the experience of location-based mobile games. It focus on the movements of individuals and society. John Ury describes 5 key forms of mobility: the mobility of objects, corporeal mobility, imaginative mobility, virtual mobility, and communicative mobility. This paradigm of mobility helps us understand the movement of people as well as increased technological mobility. It helps us ask questions like, how do we move? But also, how does media help or hinder this movement? A great example of this, I think, is when we walk through a dark park late at night, how we might call someone up so we're speaking to them on the phone to kind of help us move through that environment and feel more safe doing so, right? Recognizing that that technology is changing our experience of that place. Very important for understanding the impact of contemporary mobile media. A further turn that we might acknowledge is the locational turn. The way that mobile media technologies, the way that global positioning system, GPS coordinates, that represent place and space, gives us this really conceptual turn towards the location, not as a kind of socially constructed space, but as one rendered into data and then exploited by technology. So this location is this concept grounded in histories of cartography and geography relating to notions of wayfinding and navigation. Objects and people become locatable in ways that they weren't before, emplaced and discoverable, an important shift in how we understand mobile media, location-based data, and being in the world. Gordon and D'Souza, in a 2011 article, coined the concept of net locality, where information is locatable across networks and material places, as well to understand the way that things like URLs and IP addresses kind of create locations that render the world in kind of a machine-readable form. So location-aware gaming, to kind of bring these ideas together. Location-aware gaming, typically powered by location-aware mobile phones, draws on technologies like GPS, Google Maps, and Bluetooth to represent urban worlds. Space is important for understanding society, something that is produced through and reinforces social relationships. Place, too, is a constant process, as places have different identities for different people, acknowledging that kind of my experience as a white, 6'3" dude playing Pokemon Go in Sydney is very different to the experience of a young woman, for instance. Mobility offers a way to better understand the movement of collectives and individuals and how this is something shaped by emerging technologies. And location is a conceptual tool that helps us better understand the role of media technologies in time, space, and place. So we can kind of jump into an example like Pokemon Go to further understand how it is that what location-based mobile games are, and how it is that these kind of concepts of space and place and location and help us understand the play of these games. So Pokemon Go is a game developed by Niantic, a games development company formed in 2010 by Keyhole Inc. founder John Hank as an internal startup within Google. John Hank previously led Google's Geo division, working on software suites like Google Maps, Earth, and Street View. When Google Inc. formed into Google Alphabet in 2015, Niantic Labs split off and became their own company. They've released 4 now location-based applications: Field Trip, Ingress, Pokemon Go, and Harry Potter Wizards Unite. Ingress was their kind of first main game, developed prior to the split from Google. It was a location-based alternate reality game, fitting in with the broad categories of urban mobile game, hybrid reality games, because there's both a physical and a digital world at once. Has a global player base beyond just urban centers, and 2 teams, the Enlightened and the Resistance. It features a capture the flag style gameplay, and is essentially a game with no foreseeable end, as teams engage in a tug of war over control of the cityscape. The Niantic basically, I mean, the fiction of Niantic is that there's something that wants to get into the world, and one of the teams wants to stop it, and one of the teams wants to enable it. So these things try to get into the world through monuments of interest, statues, interesting pieces of graffiti, memorials, and other kind of interesting aspects of the city. What Niantic was doing with developing this game was trying to gamify the data collection about the built environment. Google wanted to know more than just where the streets were, but what was interesting and observable within that environment. The players of Ingress took photos of statues and these objects of interest, suggesting them as possible portals for the game world, places that you would go to and check in and control in this constant tug of war. These portals and objects of interest formed the basis of the maps in Pokemon Go, the gyms and Pokestops that would later enable the kind of game to be playing, introducing this interesting tension around this idea of the labor that went into creating this data set and the way in which it's been heavily monetized. Pokemon Go was developed by Niantic Tabs in 2016 and was a free-to-play location-based game, a joint development between Niantic and the Pokemon Company. They also had Pokemon Go Plus, wearable technology allowing you to play without directly engaging with your phone. There was a lot of controversy around many people playing in public and in places that they shouldn't be playing in. And while oftentimes I find people think of it as just a fad, they made $795 million in 2018, $894 million in 2019, and over $1 billion in 2020. The Pokemon Go created this new class of urban explorers, the Letraneurs, perhaps, a different way of being in and moving through urban spaces, like the Flaneur, or the one on the Derive. But it was also one that was deeply social. I recall playing Pokemon Go in that summer that it did come out, recognizing other people who might be playing the game in the ways that they move through the city, not in the kind of not on the same pathways as everybody else, and also kind of in the way in which they hunched looking at their phone as they moved through that environment. Being able to recognize other Pokemon trainers simply through the way they were engaging with the territory of the city in an ultimately very different way. Yet this app also highlights how it failed to encode different experiences of place in the game. That the location, right, the GPS coordinates of a place and a street that is linked to does not understand the place itself, right? There were many controversies about people playing where they shouldn't and disturbing public spaces, reflecting questions about mobility and mobile media and how we move through space and how mobile media is impacting this movement, right? People who cases in the US of people being arrested for playing where they shouldn't because of kind of who they were rather than where they were. And we also asked this question of the labor that went into producing these different portals. Pokestops is these algorithmically filtered ingress portals. The production of these portals is really important in understanding Pokemon Go. These were submitted via Ingress players with a kind of very loose set of location criteria. So the kind of cartographic process of generating these portals is this form of immaterial labor. And then these data sets become extremely valuable, as evident by the release of Pokemon Go. Some of you might be familiar with the location-based game Foursquare, where you would check in and could become mayors of places. The data set that kind of was collected by Foursquare players has become the locations that you can tag yourself as being in on Instagram, for example, right? This data has value. But more than that, the criteria of portals that we see here works towards an idea of cultural heritage. What is important to the community of players is what people take photos of, and what becomes encoded in this data set about what is the cultural heritage of a place. The Sydney Harbour, the Opera House, the Harbour Building, right? A historical building. So Pokemon Go becomes grounded in a perceived authorship of what constitutes the culture of the city. Sites of historical or cultural importance become legitimized through these data sets and the potential futures that we have for them outside of just a game like Pokemon Go. Portal criteria and user submission present a form of crowdsourced knowledge regarding what is cultural, portraying and Pokemon Pokestops and poker gyms portray specific functionality and tensions between the use of location and the experience of place, right? The University of Sydney portals and Pokestops and gyms and such all portray a history and focus on the educational function of buildings and architecture, as opposed to the kind of indigenous heritage of the land. Australia's oldest university, the first built on indigenous land, and on a site of importance to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we see kind of things like street art being kind of highlighted, and sites of landmarks to traditional owners being ignored in this kind of process, and what is a Pokestop, and what becomes encoded as locations of importance, right? They're not just these locations are not just valuable in the game as playable objects, but present a playful mode of engaging with cultural heritage. To read these locations critically as produced by immaterial labour is to challenge further legitimizing specific modes of reading place. So people do have the ability to edit the kind of representations of these locations through kind of complaint. Pokestops were removed from Sydney parks based on councils and residents' cooperation and contacting Niantic after complaints because there were too many people in parks late at night. You can pay for Pokestops to be at your business to try and encourage foot traffic. And Auschwitz Memorial in Poland, had to basically demand publicly that Niantic disable the ability to play Pokemon Go at the Auschwitz Memorial. What these kind of examples really, and there was also a big settlement between Niantic and Homeowners Association for kind of having enabled play in their space that ended up being a couple of $1,000s for each member of those homeowner associations. So these examples really highlight the implications for like who owns and manages space, right? What's a public and private space in the physical world is kind of different to what is public and private in these digital overlays that we create, which are owned and operated and sold and unsold by these proprietary companies. So to kind of summarize, to play Ingress and Pokemon Go is to engage with forms of play as a mode of labor. The early communities of interest provided value in creating the data about modes of engaging with the urban environment, providing a foundation for further rereading of city spaces, which remain kind of couched in that particular cultural view of heritage. We need to think very critically about who has the time and means to engage in such practices, and the biases they bring to the way that space becomes encoded into digital overlays, and how the data about how one moves through the cities becomes further kind of reinforces the machine's understanding of place, which might be very different to our own understanding of it. As location, the specific geocoordinates that represent place and space become more and more important in more and more technologies, so too do the decisions involved in how location becomes represented. So that brings us to the end of our lecture on location-based mobile games. I look forward to talking through some of these ideas in the tutorials. Have a great day.